a curious blend of healthcare and technology, which is digital nutrition. To acquaint us with this new development, we have Phillips Moskowitz, founder and CEO of AeBeZe Labs and Moodrise. Please, everyone, welcome our first keynote speaker for this session with a big round of applause.
Thanks very much. I have the sort of mixed and sometimes unenviable burden of being first, which for the men and women on the beaches of Normandy was not exactly the privileged position to be in. When it involves technology, it's always a bit curious. So bear with me because the display is quite a bit warped. I am going to ask you to exercise a bit of imagination relative to the original integrity or fidelity of the presentation. But one quick bit of background before we commence. The origin of this idea took place when I was the first entrepreneurship fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School that were beginning to wrestle with challenges at the intersection of public policy and health. If the last 150 years of innovation, research, and path-breaking change in medicine has been from the neck down, we all imagine that the next 50 years are going to be from the neck up. And so when I started to take a look at the world's most magnetic brands and businesses, the three variables that they had in common were one, psychopharmacology. Is Facebook's success related entirely to good fortune, vision, and execution? No, it happens to be that they're the world's largest traffickers in a neurotransmitter called dopamine. For FIFA, the chemicals of choice or preference, or the drugs that they tend to distribute, are a mixture of testosterone and adrenaline, and we could think about a variety of other examples. The second variable that we identified was deep behavioral ravines. My background was as a commerce entrepreneur. I started a company that was acquired by eBay, and I served for several years as the global chief curator at eBay. That's a very uneven and tough business. They're competing for a single purchase decision a month. Food businesses are at something of an advantage because they're competing for 21 purchase decisions a week. But consider the messaging space. People are touching their phones 200 times a day to communicate with other human beings, and that's practically a biological imperative only rivaled by breathing. That's a deep behavioral ravine. But there was a third category that we identified, which was if you can excite or alight a childlike sense of wonder and awe, if you can make me feel like I'm 5. That's something that John Lasseter understood at Pixar. It's something Walt Disney understood. It's something that Steve Jobs understood. Help me reacquaint myself with the wonders of the world. If you can do that, then you have me for share of mind and share of wallet forever. So if we took those criteria and applied them to the healthcare space, what might that look like? And that's where we developed this notion of digital nutrition. So why this? Why now? For one thing, the challenge landscape is clear and worrisome. There are 300 million people that are going to suffer from clinical depression this year. That doesn't account for the hundreds of millions of others that are going to have routine, daily, and crippling anxiety. One of the things I've pointed out is as we forcibly jettison tobacco as the primary social instrument in American life, although we still do have smokers, and certainly in Europe too, we never gave people a concomitant way to cope with unpleasant feelings. In fact, tobacco has never really meaningfully been replaced, and I'm not suggesting that we should bring smoking back. What I'm saying is we haven't taught people the basics of emotional resilience. We haven't taught them about digital literacy. We haven't taught them about digital hygiene. And we're beginning to see those issues borne out at scale everywhere on planet Earth. 56% of the people suffering are not going to get treated this year. So then we took a look across the social media landscape. 2 in 3 apps are making people feel worse after every use. Now my goal and intention here is not to heap scorn and level criticism or direct invective toward these companies. It's to just take an honest reckoning of where we are and what might next need to be done. And these are certainly not helping to advance the goal of behavioral health or well-being. Consider this small stat. I realize that we're in the Middle East at the moment, but let's take one classic example of an American city. Given the rate of suicidality these days, every 40 seconds somebody is going to tragically take their own life. That means that by the end of next year, if we started just on Jan 1 of 2020, a city the size of Seattle will be wiped out. That's astonishingly bad. I mean, one of our partners at the moment, the U.S. Air Force, has had in the last several years the highest rate of suicidality on record. Something needs to be done. This issue is obviously close to me. The reason I decided to start this company is because I've struggled mightily with my own mental health since adolescence, and I know that there's more that we can do. The average American today consumes 12 hours and 7 minutes of digital assets. That means that they spend more time looking at or listening to content than they do eating, sleeping, or drinking combined. Obviously, that has an outsized impact on and over the way that we feel. We're not doing much to meaningfully track it yet. I would not say an emerging consensus. I'd say there's a great deal of commotion about media as a potential malady. We decided to sort of flip that notion on its head. What if media could be medicine? What might that look like? So let me give you a couple of examples. Here is an eminently memorable scene from a one-time Oscar-winning movie, Shawshank Redemption. Some volume.
I have no idea to this day what those two Italian ladies were singing about. Truth is, I don't want to know. Some things are best left unsaid. I like to think they were singing about something so beautiful it can't be expressed in words and makes your heart ache because...
So that's just an example of how music alone can cast a mesmeric spell even over the men, who have no promise left in life. I think all of us have experienced a moment either in cinema or on our headsets when music had the ability to sort of transform or help us, tickle the ineffable. That's just a tiny example. That was, at least for our purposes, how dopamine can act as a powerful reward molecule. Here's a different example. This is going to be three-time, the triple world record holder for speed, Usain Bolt. This was his first world record-breaking event. No. Hard. I'm surprised that this was blocked in the UAE. There's nothing controversial about it. Well, you'll have to imagine this man shattering the world record. The reason that we used it as an example is one of the things that we find so engaging and electric about sport is that it's able to release the energy molecule in our brains known as endorphins. This is true when you watch any kind of high-octane competition, and I wanted to provide a tiny hint of it this morning. Tragically, it wasn't able to display. Let me move on to the next one. So oxytocin is commonly known as the love and bonding molecule. Here's an example of a piece of content that can trigger the release of it in your brain.
Дороги и виги проложили.
Держи, держи, он идет, держи.
Ветка немного вырубали, когда дороги и виги проложили.
We don't have to watch it on loop. It's cute, but it doesn't have to go on ad infinitum. You can move on to the next slide. The reason I wanted to use this as an example is that the same reaction that you get from kissing your child or from making love to your partner or for being affectionate and generous of spirit can be replicated. Too soon. Can we go back just one slide? I can't possibly compete with Beyonce. Well, fine, we might as well watch it and I can explain after the fact why we chose this.
I'm begging you not to go. Call your name 2-3 times in a row. Such a funny thing for me to try to explain. How I'm feeling in my pride is I'm gonna blame. I still don't understand just how you love the good. No one understands.
Because all of these are tiny examples of how content can begin to make a difference. If we can go on to the next slide, if you don't mind. The next slide on the presentation, if you don't mind. Thank you. So, Beyonce is capable of triggering a kaleidoscopic variety of powerful brain chemicals, which is why she's such not just an enigmatic, but a powerful brand. So what if we applied this principle to behavioral health and well-being? Calm is an interesting example. I think most people in this room will be familiar with the app. It's interesting. They've had 40 million downloads. Fine. I mean, by tech terms, in terms of consumer experiences, it's quite successful. But if you think of this gentleman, he's had 4.5 billion views just for a single song. That's more humans than were alive on planet Earth in the year 1980. I want to be cautious about the lessons that we draw from it, because the size of the music industry today is about $19.8 billion. That seems sufficiently prodigious. But pharma has already crossed the $1 trillion mark. And I know that members of the sort of edge tech within music are endeavoring to figure out how can we make music look more like medicine. So generally speaking, music has 100 times the great number of downloads that any individual app does, but pharma still dwarfs the size of the music industry by 50x. And so we're trying to tease or introduce this notion of pharmaceuticals that represent a massive new frontier of growth. So again, I want to walk through some examples of what this might look like in context. I don't want to spend too much time here because I know that we're running out of it quickly. What I'm hoping to impart today is that, 2013 Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Shiller has talked about narrative economics. I was trained as a political economist and focused on the Middle East at the beginning of my career. Just relying on that single discipline to make sense of the world is never really enough. You need to borrow quite liberally from adjacent disciplines, right? No one is going to give you a complete portrait of life or the explanatory devices for why things happen. If you were to divorce yourself from the notion that life is a series of contiguous stories woven together into a compelling tapestry, and you started to look at life as a series of immaculate chemical interactions, that's where we think the world is headed next. And if we can use, as a point of departure, the belief that human health and happiness is no longer comprised of 5 fundamental pillars, traditionally clinicians and clergy would agree that it's diet, sleep, exercise, interpersonal relationships, and vocation, not just job, but your calling. We would argue that the new 6th critical pillar for prosperity is digital nutrition, because of the consequences that it has on your brain and by dint of the sheer exposure to it that you're having on a daily basis. So, one of the things we started to do is to label all of the world's content by the 6 chief neurotransmitters governing mood. One is acetylcholine. That's the molecule strongly linked with focus and attention. Dopamine, which is the topic of every discussion in Silicon Valley at the moment, even including dopamine fasting, about self-confidence and rewards. Third, endorphins, the energy molecule. Fourth, GABA, which is commonly correlated with sensations of tranquility and calm. Oxytocin, the bonding and love molecule. Serotonin, the foundation that we need to erect happiness, and which can be used in association with SSRIs. And you might even include a 7th here, which would be testosterone. That's one of the things we're beginning to test with the US Air Force. There's a mountain of scientific literature out there. I think we're among the first to sort of link all of the research with specific pieces of content, so the digital landscape begins to look more like the realm of food or potables and all the items in the consumer landscape, which always bear a very thorough label. Another thing that we've done is we've started to create a series of posters. So when I grew up in the United States, whether you were in public school or private school, there was a poster in the corner of every classroom in grammar school that was called the food pyramid. It showed you the basics of nutrition. I believe that we urgently need the same for the digital era. So we've started with a series of posters that we're releasing in public high schools in America and in other select office spaces to just, by dint of exposure, teach people what these foundations are and then provide visual examples of each. Second is, and again, we wanted to start with mood rather than the chemical because the chemicals can be hard to learn. Calm and examples of content that can release these feelings. What you're beginning to see on every screen is examples of the scientific support for establishing this relationship. I'll quickly go through the others. Energy, focus, confidence, connection. The platforms that we currently have available are an experience with the U.S. Air Force that is proprietary called Daybreak. That's not available to the public. Moodrise is, and that can be downloaded on your cell phone. We have unique content for intelligent speakers for Google Home and Alexa. There's a mood tracking device for the Apple Watch and soon to be for Fitbit. And then the Moodrise 1000 Awards is an annual contest that we run, organizing the world's most nutritious content by popular platforms and by mood. So you can figure out what to watch based on the way that you want to feel on Netflix, Hulu, Vimeo, YouTube, and Amazon Prime. This is an example of what our delivery calendar looks like for 2020. I should probably pause here to see if we can field any questions. I mean, at the end of the day, I believe that the inexorable and inevitable future is that this will be commonly understood by people around the world. We're only in the early days. It's going to take a mixture of evangelism, deep industry partnership, ongoing research, intense scrutiny, and some degree of enthusiasm, because I think everyone in this room has at some point in their lives gone to a movie and felt something, right? That's only a tiny but visceral example of what we're talking about. The next stage is figuring out how to productize and fully dimensionalize digital nutrition in a way that matters and means something to every consumer on planet Earth. So let me not drone on and be a tragic bore. Let me field some questions if there are any. In the back? Sure. It's a great question. I mean, listen, what makes me laugh might not make you laugh. But we have at least enough evidence based on the things that people like, by dint of sheer downloads, that we have some indication of where it's going. And so I think that we're going to move progressively from an era of sort of generalized recommendations to mass customization, and ultimately, in due time, with enough data, true bespoke digital medicine. And so one of the things that we do within the app, other than measuring mood and recommending content based on the way you currently feel, is there's lots of different opportunities to capture feedback. And so in time, we'll have a comprehensive impression of the things that work uniquely well with and for you, but that's going to take time and greater access to reliable sources of data.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Tell me again more short, only because the light was so blinding, now I can finally see your face. Can you say it again?
Hello, good morning. The emotions, period, are less than the mood dissonance or problems. So if the person has an emotional dissonance, and for example, he was using the calm part, so how do you have the methodology to test if after using the application, he had been improved? And what is the next step of the digital nutrition? Thank you.
So mood disorders take time to correct. There is no silver bullet solution, and let's be clear. The impact that vitamins can have on your mood and well-being are very different than drugs, right? There's no way that digital nutrition can possibly compete with cocaine. But when this becomes part of your comprehensive approach to prosperity, and you become more conversant or familiar with tools and interventions that can modify the way you feel from moment to moment, the belief in the methodology here are that you can become more aware of your feelings, you can be more familiar with those triggers, you can have a comprehensive mood map. I mean, listen, imagine what the world looked like when we didn't even have crude maps of new and emerging landscapes. It made travel and commerce prohibitively difficult. Right now, we seem to be flying mostly blind, not even as a pilot would, using their instruments when it comes to our inner landscapes. So, to answer your question, one is about developing a comprehensive individual mood map. Second is about using or administering short provisions of content to correct unwanted mood states. And the third is to cohere this particular approach to the 5 other fundamentals, because I'm not here emphasizing or even suggesting that digital nutrition alone is going to solve this problem. But I think without it, we're not going to be able to make any meaningful headway.
Hi, Michael. Can you see me? Thank you so much for your
I
presentation.
can't, but I believe that you're there.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting when you attach and marry the nutrition with the different kinds of receptors, GABA, dopamine, etc. I just want to understand one thing, that across the states in US or maybe in several other countries, the triggers are obviously different for different people, as you rightly mentioned, happiness, calm, energy, etc. So has it been tested for any kind of homogenization across states, across countries, across continents?
I missed the word. Has it been tested for any?
Any homogenization, any differentiation, which is the reason why the triggers are amongst individuals? Would that be something that is already in your app tested?
It's an excellent question. We decided that we wanted to start with an intensely small audience. That's where scale can later be achieved, is you have to be ruthlessly focused at the beginning. And so the first 2 test audiences, in essence, are the men and women of the US Air Force on one particular base who are involved in intelligence gathering activities, and they have a unique set of behavioral health challenges that are actually replicated or seen in categories like radiology, air traffic control, high-frequency traders, which is that they sit in a dark room for multiple hours of the day, sitting in front of multiple screens with matters of life and death at stake, or in the case of day traders, it's not life and death, but what it feels, high-stress conditions. If we can begin to introduce methods of coping or methods of suggesting momentary breaks and interventions that have a demonstrable and meaningful impact long-term on and over the way that they feel, that can be carried across to competitive athletic programs, and it can certainly be carried across to new theaters of operation or interest, including the retail marketplace for third-party administrators and self-employed insurers. It's early, right? We want to be able to figure out what does and doesn't work in order to have a more robust approach where, as you mentioned, other markets, other demographics, other sets of similar but not precise challenges. Is that a satisfactory answer? Okay.
G'day, this is Manish. Mike, have you ever incorporated the deep sensitization of amplified signal of happiness, depression, pain, where all those neurotransmitters and receptors, yes, they are there, but they are really hypersensitized. Is there any data suggesting how we desensitize those receptors?
It's an outstanding question. In fact, although I can't announce yet the partnership that we're about to commence with one of the what can I say without giving away too much, with a large outside entity. That's about as cryptic as I can be to be helpful. One of their chief questions was, one, how do we account for neurodiversity in our approach? And the second was, how do we account for or prevent against desensitization? So I can argue this both for and against myself. I find, I have a pathological fixation with specific songs and other types of material, and no matter how often I listen to it, I never grow weary or bored. And yet, there are other kinds of material that I appreciate profoundly less every time that I watch it. So, I think there are going to be, and we'll learn this about people at the individual level, there are going to be types of material that can work again and again and again with the same effectiveness as a prayer. I mean, listen, even as a Jewish guy in the UAE, I am deeply moved and touched every time I hear the muazzin throughout the day from the minarets. I'm moved. I appreciate that. I can think of other people who have a different reaction. We need to figure out what resonates with each audience member, and I think that for us as content creators and curators, we have to strike an incredibly delicate balance between being science first, being science friendly, meaning because most people don't have PhDs, always doing the right thing, and figuring out the right mix of novelty/newness and effectiveness, which is a different measurement of success than efficacy, which is the golden standard in pharma.
Follow-on question. Is there been any research study cohort done looking at nocebo and placebo effect of happiness or depression or pain?
That's an outstanding question. I mean, I think that I think there have to be 5 or 6 different behavioral health economics or health books popularized by favorable reviews in the New York Times, all about the potent effects of placebo. It's premature for us to address that specific issue. What I would say is, if it works, if it makes a demonstrable, meaningful, and material difference to people, I'm less concerned about placebo than I am about outcome. But I think that we need to get there in time. I think that what should be of interest to pharma is two things. One, do we commonly believe that there's going to be an ethereal vertical that lives comfortably alongside proprietary pills and powders? I would say that that's a foregone conclusion. What might that look like? This is one approach. There will soon be others. How do we get better at measuring the impact or the triggering effects of neurotransmitters other than through blood draws or fMRIs and the rest? We have to get better. I think talking about this today is a bit like forecasting the future of AI at a robotics conference at MIT Media Labs in 1977. It seems promising, but it's gonna take the expiration of at least another decade before we get to something that becomes a household term.
Thank you. You are a very smart man.
Here it is. Thanks, Michael. Wonderful thought concepts. In terms of administering digital nutrition, and I'm talking about once you establish all the facts and then, you establish all those things, would you need a digital nutritionist, or will it be a job of a GP or a specialist or a psychotherapist, or, administering or channelizing this in terms of healthcare practice?
It's a brilliant question.
How you look at it?
It's one that I don't even know I've begun to consider with sufficient focus or ardor yet. My instinctual response is a care team is something that is of vital human importance to each and every one of us. I confessed earlier, I've been suffering from behavioral health my entire life. I've spent periods as a teenager hospitalized for long periods of time. I've been in and out of therapy sessions for my entire adult life. I've been on meds and off meds. It's a delicate balancing act. It also changes not just with your genetics or with your age, but with your own physical chemistry and life circumstance. And so I think that a legitimate care team for people that struggle, as I have and will, is comprised of a psychotherapist, a prescribing psychiatrist, if necessary, a nutritionist or exercise specialist to keep you on track. And I think in this domain, there are going to be many people that take interest equally, and those will be people that partner with you on your intake, on your caloric intake. That will be members of your physical and mental health care team. But my hope is that some of this can be, I wouldn't say automated, but made more empathic automatically in order to anticipate and deliver or meet your needs, and that still might take a bit more time. I think one of the initiatives that I'm most excited about in Washington is beginning to advance this discussion on a national level so we can start with the people who are most in need of it. Grammar school students who don't yet have cell phones full-time, high school students who are going to be navigating this world with unenviable challenges for the next several decades, and there should be, without worrying about regulation, because I think that can be ultimately unhelpful or at least premature, there needs to be broader education about and around the basics. So I appreciate the question because I think it's something that we should begin to entertain and consider. Is this a new career field? Potentially. Is it something that should be, as I said, productized on the digital side so it can act as a tool, resource, and instrument for qualified practitioners? Let's figure that out, but it's a wonderful challenge and a terrific question.
You able to hear me? I'm Dr. Akshay, actually. I'm a pediatrician and a pediatric intensivist. Hello? You're able to hear me? Yeah. So I'm a doctor, basically. I'm a pediatrician and a pediatric intensivist, and my father is a fetal medicine specialist. And I was exploring, when you said, digital nutrition for different age groups, why not for mothers, basically? Because, I did a small study, I actually asked the Beethoven's for Elise. I asked my sister to repeat that when she was pregnant, basically. And then, the child was born, and then, I didn't have much time to interact with him, but he's now 5 years old, and he has amazing music memory, because I have learned music when I was 3 years old, and then he has music memory, and he understands music faster, and he's more calmer than other children. And maybe that is a very good, this one, maybe a new, one more aspect which you can probably focus on, that is mothers. Yeah.
So let me build on that example. One of these, I'll give you two examples. One is far more controversial than the other. There was a line in Nick Hornby's original manuscript book, which was later turned into a movie, High Fidelity, and he said, I don't know if I was depressed because I listened to pop music, or I listened to pop music because I was depressed. It might work in both directions, candidly. But when I think about this, there's the beneficial application of it, as I've started to describe, but there's a prior example that's very controversial, where this was done at scale in apartheid South Africa. I will explain. In the latter days of the regime, not F.W. de Klerk, before him, there was a strict prohibition against any material other than nature programming in the Bantustans, believing that it could agitate the natives. That is the most horrifyingly racist, but shockingly powerful precedent for this approach. Now, am I advocating that autocratic, imposing, and unethical regimes embrace digital nutrition for mind control? No, far from it. I'll give you the example that I think we've seen scattered examples of everywhere in Hollywood in the last couple of years. In the recent movie Ad Astra with Brad Pitt, not a good movie, but the premise is amazing. It's Apocalypse Now meets Stanley Kubrick's 2001. Brilliant. Go make that movie. Well, they did. And in that movie, they have comfort rooms, which is sort of what you're describing, is the administration of healthful provisions of content to adjust, augment, or improve mood. Great. And he also has self-disclosure moments where he checks in, as we do in our app, with an intelligence that can interpret or interpolate your content and remarks to figure out how the way you feel. Those two things have to work together interoperably. So do I think mothers should be listening to it while they're carrying children? You bet. I think a lot of women are doing that already. They watch television, listen to music, to adjust. We all do these things. So I'm not taking something stunningly or stupidly obvious and productizing it. We're trying to deepen or leverage an existing human behavior in service of delivering a more desirable outcome, because abstaining from this isn't a realistic approach.
Absolutely, yes.
And I'm sorry if that was an imperfect way of addressing the remark. If there was a narrower question, I promise to deliver one.
Basically, like what I would have, I think you have, perfectly understood the context as such. But only thing is, like, it has to be individualized, and also, like, they have the right whether they want it or no. That is absolutely right. But only thing is, like, it has helped, and we have studies also. Wherein it has helped. So basically, like, you can actually, only thing was, like, you can expand the domain of usage everywhere, basically. And as you said, like, about radiologists, they do, actually, like, many of the radiologists and even surgeons, they keep music on when they're doing the surgery.
That's right.
Yes, and that actually keeps them in pace, and that keeps them alert always. And because they have listened it so many times, it's not about the music, but it keeps them calm.
So the surgery example is a terrific one, and maybe this is a place where we can end unless there's other questions, which is, for some audiences, the application, administration, or consumption of symphony music, which we often see in the cutting room, in the operation room, can produce, for some people, the release of acetylcholine, the focus molecule. For other audiences, it triggers the release of GABA, the calming molecule. But for people who love classical music, it releases dopamine. Now, could it be a kaleidoscope of all three? You bet. But I think it's only with rigorous testing and the sharing of data and outcomes that we're going to begin to figure out the precise right mix for each person in each context, accompanied by each challenge.
Yes, absolutely. And also, like, as you mentioned, like, each hormone has other things which happen on the face, or even you have changes in the whether dilatation, constriction of the pupils. I mean, you can actually indirectly see the effects of these molecules on the brain, basically. So basically, like, we can probably, in a way, without them actually answering the questions, we can probably get answers, maybe from face recognition or even facial recognition of emotions.
Quite right.
Hi, Michael. Sorry, I'm back again to ask another question. I'm sure you're tired of these, but I think I would regret not asking you this.
Please.
When it comes to technology, addiction is always a big question. And I think something I'm particularly interested in is in sustainable solutions. So you mentioned smoking, cocaine, things that we have previously relied on in order to sustain our own mental health. How do we ensure that something like this does not, get abused and used as in an addictive manner rather in a healthy manner?
It's an excellent question. I mean, our approach for the moment is the following. One, there are a lot of comorbidity issues when it comes to diagnosing mental health. They often don't occur in isolation. We would, I'd say, comfortably argue that most of the use of technology today has entered into the realm of what would classically constitute the pathological or the addictive. What we're going to do about it is an altogether different question. Not all addictions are equal in their sort of injustice to the soul. Some things are much more corrosive and toxic than others. My view was that if we look at the preposterous approaches to drug eradication, interdiction, or demand suppression in the 1980s, just telling kids to say no isn't a realistic solution. Abstinence only is tough to enforce, maintain, champion, or make desirable. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that 1964 represented peak tobacco in America. I think 564 billion cigarettes were consumed that year. Fewer now, but there still are smokers. I'm not sure that we were ever able to recover from the use of nicotine to combat, meaning so many people grew accustomed to it over so long, I think it's left a chasm in its wake. And I think that one of the issues that we stare menacingly down the barrel of in America is a spiritual crisis that we haven't figured out how to remedy or solve. This alone will not do that. But the propensity to develop a digital addiction to healthy materials appears at face value to be profoundly less significant or problematic than the proven ability of people to develop addictive consumption of less healthy materials. So it's something that I think we need to weigh and consider. It doesn't appear to be as, and again, pardon the term, I'm using this quite loosely now, it doesn't appear, based on research and existing science, to be nearly as carcinogenic as other asset types. That's part of the reason that we're doing it. But could there be externalities, meaning unanticipated side consequences that we don't foresee today? You bet. But the entire risk profile is significantly, like by an order of magnitude, less worrisome than some of the other coping strategies, instruments that people use to alleviate pain, and as such, more worthy of active pursuit and development.
So this is not a question, but trying to ask your views on, so when you talk about nutrition, it's still individualistic in nature.
No, I hear you. I just wanted to see you.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's more individualistic in nature. I could be high on these scales, but when I interact with someone, I could be off the charts, rude. Right. You know.
Yeah.
So have you ever thought about the quality of collective nutrition rather than individualistic nutrition?
Well, that's fascinating. Listen, let me put it this way. There is no comparison between vitamin C and cocaine. Okay? There's not. You don't have people sitting around trying to snort orange juice to get their dose every single day. But what I would say is that if you look at any bodega in London or New York City, and you look at the candy aisle specifically, you will see more products today branded as high in protein than arguably ever before. Somehow, that specific sliver of physical nutrition has entered the public consciousness, and everybody wants to have protein drinks, protein substitutes, protein powders. My hope is that someday people are going to have an equal degree of proficiency in this field. But I want to be clear, I am not advocating the consumption of digital assets in lieu of physical interaction. Remember the fundamental five? Diet, key, sleep, essential. Interpersonal relationships are profoundly valuable. I think these are things that the Academy is going to have to consider to wrestle with. And in the age of allegedly social media, which is almost antisocial, there is no remedy for an ailing human suffering from the crippling effects of loneliness than the presence of another human being. And so my hope is that this can act prophylactically as vitamins, not the way that drugs react in the most potent and convincing way possible with short periods of administration and wild vicissitudes in feeling. It's about moderating and sort of maintaining, achieving a more maintainable state with literacy and hygiene. So I agree with you almost violently. If we could get everybody out of their houses, off their phones, interacting with people with the same degree of eye contact and smiling that you often witness in pre-industrial or indigenous societies, we'd all be better off. But I'm dealing with the challenges that we have. I'm dealing with the world as it is, not as I wish it were.
Ladies and gentlemen, so sorry, this will be our last question, and you can definitely ask Mr. Michael all of your questions after the session and the break. So, yeah, that would be the end of the Q&A for this session. Round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.